Knitting needles click, but one stitch hides a deadly truth. Welcome to Clue Hunt. I am your host, Elena Gray. Where are you listening from today? Your comments weave this community closer. Let's unravel the case. In the quiet heart of St. Mary, Mead, the knitting circle met every second Wednesday in the back room of the library. It was not a formal society, nor did it claim great skill in the art of wool. Yet each woman came religiously, basket in hand, shawl over shoulder, not just to stitch, but to speak. Gossip was the true thread that bound them. Miss Marple attended often, but rarely brought more than a small square of lace. Her real talent lay not in patterns, but in listening, really listening. And so it was that she noticed, before anyone else, the odd silence of Emily Carter. Emily had been a cheerful, chatty widow with an appetite for lavender biscuits and murder mysteries. But on this particular afternoon, she sat hunched, her needles unmoving, her eyes darting toward the door. She laughed too loudly at a poor joke and dropped her scissors twice. After the meeting, Miss Marple offered to walk her home. Emily hesitated, and then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, whispered, "There's something I ought to tell someone, but I daren't." "Then you must tell me," said Miss Marple, "or you will find that silence has its own cost." Emily looked at her with something like relief, but she said only, "Tomorrow after tea, my cottage." The next day, Emily Carter was found dead, slumped in her armchair, knitting in her lap, a small half-finished baby bonnet still on the needles. The police suspected heart failure. She was old after all, but Miss Marple knew better. The kettle had boiled, the cup had been poured, but there was no saucer, and Emily Carter, who had never taken tea without a saucer, had clearly been interrupted. The bonnet, too, spoke in its own quiet language. 4 rows too many, 1 stitch missing, and a thread pulled tight, as if someone had snatched it from her hand and too late. The village was gentle in its grief, as it always was when someone like Emily Carter passed. There were flowers on the windowsill, cards posted through the door, and murmured condolences at the grocer. But grief in St. Mary Mead often wore a bonnet of politeness, even when doubt twisted beneath it. Miss Marple, however, didn't mourn quietly. She studied. At the library 2 days later, the knitting circle met again. And though Emily's chair was left empty, her name was on every tongue, softly, cautiously. "She always liked lavender yarn," muttered Mrs. Pike, knotting a scarf. "Said it was calming to the nerves." "She hadn't looked well," added young Betty Thorne, her needles tapping too fast. "Shaky hands, maybe it was coming on for days." "Then why?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Did she buy 2 yards of silk ribbon last Tuesday, for the baby bonnet?" The needles stopped. Silence unfurled like a dropped ball of wool. "Perhaps she was making it for someone," said Mrs. Treadwell, her voice thin. "A gift?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but for whom? Emily's grandchildren live in Leeds, and she hadn't mentioned any visitors." Betty flushed, looking down. "She might have made it for Lucy." "Lucy?" Miss Marple turned her head. "I thought Lucy Farrow had lost the child." "She did," Betty whispered. "Last year, but some say she's expecting again. Quietly. She hasn't told anyone. Just the girls at the library." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A secret pregnancy, a baby bonnet, a sudden death. She left the circle early and walked to the grocer's. Mr. Marley, ever watchful, greeted her with a nod. "Looking for your tea biscuits, Miss Marple?" "No, dear," she said sweetly. "Just a memory. Did Emily Carter come in last Tuesday?" "Indeed she did," he said. "Bought biscuits, lavender soaps, and a tin of condensed milk." Miss Marple frowned. "Condensed milk?" "Yes." Strange, that. She never bought it before. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, her tea untouched, knitting forgotten in her lap. She reviewed it all in her mind. Condensed milk, lavender soap, a bonnet for a baby that had not yet been announced, and a woman who had said, "There's something I ought to tell someone." Emily had found out something that could not be spoken aloud in the circle, only whispered perhaps into the ear of a friend. But someone had heard it first, and Emily had died before she could finish her stitch. The day after Emily Carter's funeral, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, Lucy Farrow. Lucy, barely 24, stood at the gate with trembling hands, clutching a faded blue knitting bag. Her eyes were red, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Marple," she said, "I think Emily left this for you." Inside the bag was nothing extraordinary to the average eye. A half-used ball of lavender yarn, a pair of size 8 bamboo needles, and a folded scrap of silk ribbon the color of apricots. But Miss Marple, knew Emily Carter never used silk. She had arthritic fingers. Cotton was easier to handle. And then beneath the yarn was a small piece of lined paper, tucked neatly between the folds. It read, "LF does not know. I saw her leave Betty's at 5. She was crying. Someone else. Knows. Someone much older. Not safe. I will tell Jane tomorrow." "LF," Miss Marple murmured. "Lucy Farrow." Lucy nodded slowly. "I was at Betty's that evening. I didn't tell anyone. Betty's brother was visiting. He said things about the baby. I got scared. I didn't know Emily had followed me." Miss Marple placed a hand gently over Lucy's. "You weren't the secret, dear. You were the key." She sent Lucy home and then began thinking about the note again. The word that stood out wasn't crying, or older, or even tomorrow. It was not safe. Later that evening, Miss Marple walked to the rectory. Reverend Finch had been Emily Carter's spiritual guide for over 30 years, and she suspected, more importantly, the man Emily trusted with her guilt. He welcomed her into the dim parlor, and Miss Marple got straight to the point. "Reverend, did Emily Carter ever come to confession in the last week of her life?" He paused. "She didn't say much, but she asked me a strange question. If a person saw something years ago and stayed silent, and now the truth was coming back, was it her duty to speak?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And what did you say?" I told her. "Silence, if it protects wrong, becomes part of the wrong." Outside, night had fallen. But in Miss Marple's mind, threads were tying themselves together. Emily had discovered something about Lucy Farrow's visit to Betty's house. Someone older was there, someone who should not have been, someone who knew what Lucy didn't. Emily had planned to tell Miss Marple the next day, but someone got to her first, and now Miss Marple believed that the bonnet Emily had been knitting wasn't a gift at all. It was a warning. Miss Marple had long known that the past didn't stay. Buried, not in St. Mary Mead. It often sat politely in a drawer tucked beneath yellowing linens, waiting for someone to open it. And that's exactly what she did when she visited Clara Bletchley. Clara had been the quietest member of the knitting circle, soft-spoken, slow to smile, never without her beige cardigan and a cup of weak tea. She rarely joined in the gossip, but never missed a meeting. And she had known Emily Carter the longest. "Such a terrible loss," Clara said, as she poured tea into faded porcelain cups. "She was more than a friend." Miss Marple sipped quietly. "Did Emily ever mention Betty's brother to you?" Clara's hands paused. "You mean Henry?" "I do." Clara's voice dropped. "Emily never trusted him. Said he reminded her of someone from years ago, the war days. But I never asked." Miss Marple leaned forward. "She saw him the day she died. She told Lucy Farrow something frightened her." Clara looked down at her lap. "Emily was frightened often these last few years, but she never said why." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And yet you keep a drawer in your sideboard locked, may I?" Clara hesitated, then nodded slowly. Inside was a bundle of old photographs, tied with red thread. Miss Marple untied it gently. They were black and white, edges curling, some faded nearly to ghost. But one stood out. A group photo, 6 women in nurses' uniforms standing in front of a war hospital tent. Among them, a young Emily Carter smiling. A younger Clara staring directly into the camera, and behind them near the tent flaps was a man, tall in civilian clothes, handsome, smiling. Miss Marple tapped the corner of the photo. "Is that Henry?" Clara's voice cracked. "Yes. He wasn't called Henry then. He went by William Brackett. He worked with the supply trains. He hurt someone." "Hurt?" "Not physically. But he lied. He forged a requisition and disappeared with medicines. Someone else was blamed, a nurse. She was sent away." Miss Marple's mind moved quickly. "Do you remember her name?" "Sarah. Sarah Lynn. A quiet girl. She left in disgrace." "Not Betty's mother?" Clara gasped. "Yes," Miss Marple said slowly. "Sarah Lynn married late. Her daughter is Betty Thorne. That would make Henry her uncle." The silence between them was thick as wool. Emily Carter had recognized William Brackett. She'd seen him talking to Lucy. She'd realized he was not Henry the visitor. He was the man who'd disappeared in wartime shame, come back under a new name. And someone else had realized Emily knew. Betty Thorne lived in a charming, whitewashed cottage with geraniums on the sill and a row of mismatched boots at the door. When Miss Marple arrived, Betty was hanging wool to dry in the back garden, skeins of sky blue, rose pink and bone white, fluttering like flags of peace. "Oh, Miss Marple," Betty said brightly. "Come in. I just brewed some mint tea." Miss Marple followed her inside, noticing the precision of the kitchen, not a teaspoon out of place. Betty poured with grace, smiled with kindness, and waited just a moment too long before asking, "What brings you here?" Miss Marple didn't answer right away. She pulled a small photograph from her handbag and placed it gently on the table. "Do you know who that is?" she asked. Betty's eyes fell on the image. Her fingers stiffened just a second, then relaxed. "That's my mother, the one in the back. She rarely spoke of the war, said it left her bitter." Miss Marple nodded. "That's Sarah Lynn. She was blamed for theft at a field hospital, sent home in shame. Did you know?" "No," Betty said quickly. "Not until recently. I overheard my uncle, Henry, speaking with Emily at the grocer's. They didn't know I was there. He was nervous. She was furious." She recognized him, Miss Marple said softly. She remembered him not as Henry, but as William Brackett, the man who vanished after letting your mother take the fall. Betty's lips trembled, but she pressed them into a line. She was never the same after the war, she said. She'd knit for hours in silence. She never went to church. She stopped smiling. Miss Marple leaned forward. "So you decided. Someone had to answer for that. And you knew Emily was going to speak to me, that she planned to name your uncle." Betty's hands dropped into her lap. She stared at the table. "I only wanted her to be quiet. I didn't mean for her to. I thought just a small dose, something to make her sleep. But she had a weak heart." Miss Marple sat back, sorrow softening her gaze. "You used the condensed milk, dissolved it in tea, a sleeping powder, not meant to kill, but enough to silence." She wouldn't. "Stop," Betty said. She kept asking questions. She was going to ruin him again. I couldn't bear it. I just wanted it all to stop. Miss Marple nodded gently. "You did it for your mother, but she never asked you to." Tears welled in Betty's eyes. "No," she whispered. "She wouldn't have wanted this. She just wanted peace." "And now," Miss Marple said quietly, You'll have to find it in truth, not silence. The next morning, St. Mary Mead woke to heavy skies and a slow, steady drizzle, the sort of rain that made roofs groan and secrets soften. Miss Marple stood at her window, watching as water streaked down the panes like lines of a confession waiting to be written. She picked up the photograph of Sarah Lynn and slid it into a brown envelope, along with the handwritten note from Emily and a brief letter of her own. The constable's office wasn't far, and the time for hesitation had passed. Sergeant Bickley received her with his usual gruff politeness. "Miss Marple," he said, taking the envelope with mild curiosity. "Another one of your quiet little storms, is it?" "You might say that," she replied. "Her gentle death that began long ago, during a war no one talks about, and ended with a girl too young to understand how grief can twist." As he read through the letter and examined the note, his face changed, not with shock, but with the weight of inevitability. "Sleeping powder, you say? In the condensed milk?" "Yes," she said softly. No criminal record, no malice in her heart. Just too much silence. Too many unanswered questions about a mother who carried someone else's shame. He nodded, slowly. "We'll speak with her, quietly. Maybe keep it out of the press." Miss Marple placed her gloved hands in her lap. "If justice must come, let it be kind." She returned to her cottage, where a single envelope awaited her on the hall table. No stamp, no address, just her name in neat script, Jane Marple. Inside was a square of soft baby blue yarn and a note. I thought I was doing it for her, but now I know I did it for myself. Thank you for showing me the difference. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. The rain tapped gently on the roof. She made tea, without milk, without sugar, without any fuss, just the way Emily had once served it when no one was looking. She sipped slowly. Some justice arrived in handcuffs. Some justice arrived in letters, and some she knew arrived in the form of a girl who chose, at last, to tell the truth. Evening light slanted through the curtains of Heatherbank Cottage as Miss Marple opened her drawer and pulled out a familiar book, bound in green cloth, worn at the corners. Its pages scented faintly of lavender and old ink. Her private diary. She turned to a blank page near the end, picked up her fountain pen and began to write, slowly, deliberately. Some secrets are tied with ribbon, others with silence. I have known many types of guilt in my life. Loud ones, bitter ones, and those that wear perfume and pearls. But this was woven from grief. Betty Thorne did not murder Emily Carter in anger. She merely reached out in panic, and silence did the rest. But the story does not begin with Betty, it begins with Sarah Lynn. Sarah, who was blamed for a crime she did not commit. Sarah, who never cleared her name, who raised a daughter with quiet hands and quiet tears, and never once spoke of the shame that was not hers. And so Betty became the voice her mother never found. In trying to protect that memory, she ended up repeating the wound. Miss Marple paused, her eyes drifting toward the window, where the last of the sun melted into rose-colored dusk. Emily Carter was not innocent either. She had seen the truth, once, decades ago, and chose to walk away from it. Perhaps she believed she had done her part by surviving, but in the end, even she could not run from the stitch she dropped so many years ago. It caught her and unraveled everything. Miss Marple closed the diary gently, like one folds a shawl after a long day. She placed it in her drawer, locked it, and tucked the key beneath a china teacup, her own small ritual. She walked to her armchair, lifted her unfinished knitting, and began to cast on a new row. Outside, the wind stirred the roses. Inside, the circle was closed, and in St. Mary Mead another murder had been solved, not with guns or fingerprints, but with memory, mercy, and a woman who knew the difference between a dropped stitch and a buried truth. 3 weeks later, The knitting circle gathered once more in the library's quiet back room. The chairs were set out neatly. The kettle hummed. The air smelled of lemon shortbread and camphor, with just a hint of lavender that clung to old wool. But something had changed. There were fewer voices, fewer hands, and fewer stories. Betty Thorne had quietly left St. Mary Mead. No one said exactly where she went, only that she'd gone to stay with a cousin near the sea. Some whispered she wouldn't return. Others said she might once things had been forgotten. But Miss Marple knew some absences do not return, not fully, not really. As the women picked up their needles, Miss Marple sat down in her usual chair, her shawl folded neatly, her yarn untouched. Her gaze moved gently across the group. Clara Bletchley, who now spoke more than she ever had before, Lucy Farrow, whose fingers trembled as she worked baby pink yarn into a soft booty, and Nora Green, who'd never liked gossip, now suddenly curious about every silence. "I miss Emily," someone said softly. "So do I," Miss Marple replied. "She was sharper than her stitches and twice as loyal." There was a pause, and then a quiet nodding all around. The kind that only women who had lived long lives could give. Women who knew that grief didn't leave. It simply changed its seat. Clara poured tea. Lucy passed around the biscuits. And slowly, the sound of needles resumed. Not rushed. Not cheerful but steady. A sound like breathing. A sound like life. Miss Marple reached into her basket and pulled out a ball of grey-blue yarn. She cast on 13 stitches, a new beginning. Perhaps just a scarf. Perhaps more. And as the rain began to tap gently against the windows once more, she smiled, because the circle had met again, because the thread, though broken, had been tied, and because in St. Mary Mead, even secrets once unravelled could become something softer. A week after the knitting circle met again, the rain returned to St. Mary Mead, not loud or storming, just the kind that quietly reminded one of things forgotten. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, watching droplets trace slow paths down the window pane. She was not knitting. She was remembering, because something still tugged at her, not loud, not sharp, just a thread at the edge of her thoughts. She opened her diary, the one she kept separate from her case files, more memory than evidence, and turned to the page marked Emily. She had written, "Betty gave the sleeping powder," but she was not the only one who knew. Because in that last knitting circle before Emily's death, there had been another face, quiet, almost invisible, Mrs. Grace Fellows, widowed, soft-voiced, always sat in the corner by the bookshelf, claimed poor hearing, claimed worse memory. But Miss Marple remembered clearly that on the day Emily Carter died, it had been Grace who'd gone into the kitchen with her. To fetch sugar, she'd said, and Grace who'd returned without any. More than that, Grace had been a wartime nurse too, one of the women in the photograph, and when Emily had discovered the truth about William Brackett, Grace would have been the first to know what Emily might do. She had protected him once, and perhaps quietly she had done so again. Miss Marple didn't write her suspicions down for the police. There was no proof, no confession, no evidence, just a single sentence she wrote for herself. Sometimes the real poison isn't what's poured, it's what's allowed. Grace Fellows stopped attending the circle after Betty left. No one asked why, but Miss Marple noticed. The bookshelf corner remained empty, and some silences she knew are not for solving, they are for remembering. Spring returned to St. Mary Mead quietly and fully, as if the village itself had exhaled. Blossoms brightened hedgerows, children's laughter floated across lanes, and the knitting circle, smaller now but steadier, began to find its rhythm once more. At the library's back room, chairs were rearranged. Lucy Farrow now sat where Emily, Carter once had her belly softly rounded, her fingers slower but more certain. Clara Bletchley brought elderflower cordial instead of biscuits, and the silence that once hovered like a storm now lingered gently, like mist. Miss Marple walked, kinshawl folded neatly over her arm, a fresh skein of cream wool tucked into her basket. She smiled at the sight of it all, not unchanged but not broken either. When tea was poured and needles began their familiar music, Lucy asked quietly, "Will we ever be as we were?" Miss Marple stirred her cup, then said with a smile, "No, my dear, we'll be better." And in that moment it was true, because the circle had survived. Not just the murder, not just the lies, but the silence. And in speaking the truth, in letting the yarn of pain unwind fully, they had found space for something else. Warmth. Understanding. Grace. Later that evening, in the quiet of her sitting room, Miss Marple opened her diary one final time. She wrote, "Only a single line. Every stitch is a choice. Some mend, some unravel, and some, when placed just right, make peace." She closed the book, set it on the shelf. Then, by lamplight, she picked up her knitting and began again.